Today we're talking about nutrition for endurance racing. You've done all the work, you've prepared yourself perfectly, and the last thing you want to do is not get the result that you deserve because of inadequate fueling or incorrect fueling on race day.
So when we're doing events that last more than 90 minutes, that's when you got to start thinking about our nutrition. If your race is an hour or less, you generally aren't going to run into any problems with fuel availability. The reason we talk about 90 minutes is because we've got to think about your energy stores in your body. So in endurance events, our main energy use is through glycogen. You use a bit of fat, of course, and fat is a very important part of the fuel equation, but the primary source of energy is going to be glycogen. Your glycogen is stored in the liver, which stores about 100 grams of glycogen, and then in the muscles, and the average there is about 500 grams, but we vary from 300 grams to 700 grams depending on the size of the individual and also your training. The more you train, your muscles learn to store more glycogen. So in looking at this, depending on the intensity that you run at and how far you run, and most of the time that you spend running determines how long your glycogen stores can last. Your liver glycogen is mostly reserved for the brain. Your brain is basically a continuous glucose user. So the liver glycogen basically tops up blood glucose and makes sure your brain has a constant supply. So you rely on muscle glycogen for exercise. So for most people, depending on the intensity, we start worrying about how much glycogen is available for you after about an hour and a half of running to about 2 hours of running, or any exercise. At this point, you're starting to look at having low stores of glycogen. This means that you have less energy available to you, and it's also evidence that low glycogen also impairs muscle function, meaning that you're going to be feeling that running is difficult. So once your event approaches 90 minutes, you've got to start having a strategy in place to replenish your glycogen stores or your glucose stores when you're exercising. And think about it this way, you don't want to wait until you're at 90 minutes of running to do it. You want to start doing this early on in your race so you don't get to the point where you are working on low stores. So with this in mind, you can't just rock up at a race and be like, okay, I'm going to start taking in gels or energy bars. So we do this in training. And the best place to do this is in your long runs. So in your long runs, you want to start almost like training your gut to be able to take in all of the sugar that you want to be using in the runs. If you don't train your gut, what happens when you're running is that you dehydrate, you end up with low blood volume, and this means that clearing your stomach, your gut, is very difficult. So if you just start taking gels in a race, start practicing, you're going to struggle to absorb all the sugar. So we want to start doing this in training. So when you go out for your long runs, we want to see athletes fueling their long runs from the beginning in the same strategy that they're going to be using in a race. And later on in the video, we'll be talking about how much energy you should be using, but essentially in your training, you want to start learning how and when you want to take in your carbs.
Before we get into the specifics around what you should be taking in during an event or right before the event, the whole nutrition side of things leads back a couple of weeks before. Naturally in training, we should be getting our strategies right, what we're taking in, fueling well enough for our training runs. But we often get a question around preloading for an event. You may have heard of things like events advertising pasta parties, or the night before, come and join a pasta party and there's pasta and all sorts of carbohydrates on offer at an event like that. How effective is preloading for your race or your ultra event? Now, there definitely is a need for loading. There's an effectiveness to carbo loading in particular. However, it's how we go about it that makes it effective. There isn't doing this pasta party the night before and a massive bowl of pasta the night before your race has got absolutely no benefit to that. Your body can only store a certain amount of carbohydrates, for example, and it's going to get rid of the rest. And a lot of the times, if that's not something you're used to, it's also going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable the next morning and on race day itself. When we talk about loading and preloading, if we look at the week before the event, possibly even 2 weeks before the event, when you get into your taper phase, your volume of training is already slowly starting to decrease. 2 weeks out, a week out from race day, it decreases even further. And as a result of lower training volume, we're obviously burning less fuel. So naturally, if you don't change anything you do on your fueling intake, you're already storing more because you're burning less of that. So think about it like that, that there's a natural loading that you are doing just by reducing your training load. There is again, however, that benefit of taking in a little bit more. So when I talk about taking in a little bit more, again, I'm not saying massive bowls of pasta or pizzas and those sort of things the whole week in every meal. But when you're having dinner, for example, add another half a potato to that. If you're eating pasta and that's something that you generally do, maybe add just a little bit more to that. So you can take in a little bit more, but you don't need to be taking in these massive bowls and thinking, geez, I'm going to burn so much on race day, I need to be storing as much as I possibly can now. That is naturally happening with a decrease in your training load. The same really applies for hydration in this instance as well. More often than not, most runners get to the start line in a state of dehydration already. In our daily lives, we don't always drink enough and we're not always staying well hydrated. So now you get to race day, you've got your hydration strategy in place, you've got all your bottles, you know when you're going to walk or take something in at those aid stations, so you're going to hydrate really well on race day. But you forget that you're also sometimes starting on the back foot. So in that week of a race leading up to the event, I would recommend taking in a little bit more, focusing on getting in enough hydration in the week, potentially playing around with some salt in your water or electrolytes if it is something, if you do have a high sweat rate, for example, just to improve your absorption. So staying hydrated, getting to the start line well hydrated and a full fuel tank, and then obviously on race day getting the strategy right with the rest of your nutrition.
All right, so we get to race day, and Dev's covered what you do in the few days leading up to race day. And when I say race day, very often athletes think, okay, well, what do I do during my race? It doesn't start there, it starts just before that. So you really want to ensure that you're getting a good source of nutrition before your race that is really going to sustain you for the first 45 minutes or so of your race. A lot of people always go, oh, well, you know what, I can't eat. I struggle to eat before I run. Really, we can train that as an aspect, and you need to be training that using that to train your gut in your training, so that when you get to race day, you're able to sustain that. So a breakfast of sorts that is really carb heavy is really important to have, and you want to be having this, I would say, 45 minutes to an hour before your race. Okay, that, as I mentioned, that is going to sustain you for the first 45 minutes or so. And if you do really struggle and you can't eat before you start your race, something that is really useful is like a glass of fruit juice, some sort of carbohydrate to at least sustain you. So then you're not necessarily eating something that's heavy, but you're getting some carbohydrates to take you through those first couple of minutes or 45 minutes of your race. Here in South Africa, we have very lovely warm weather, and so most of our races start in summer season around 5:30 a.m. and so this does present a challenge then if you are racing in South Africa and you need to have some sort of fueling before. As I mentioned, a nice juice, fruit juice of sorts, like a cranberry juice, is really a good idea. The orange juice, sometimes the high fructose levels in that can affect the gut, so stick with the berry kind of juice. That is a nice way to do it. Or as you are driving on your way to the race, have an energy drink of sorts that you're sipping on the way there. Banana, also a great source as well. I know for me personally, I like to have a slice of toast with peanut butter and banana. Some people might be rolling their eyes at that combination, but that works for me. And it's just something to at least sustain me for the first 30 to 45 minutes of my race. Internationally, you guys have the luxury of starting your races a little bit later, which is great, because then you really can allow yourself some time to get in a good breakfast and some good fueling before your race starts. And as South Africans, if you are then going overseas and running races overseas, just factor that in, that you want to make sure that you do that in your training, so that you know that you can, your gut and your stomach can sustain that meal before you start your race. Very often at these races, I know, for as an example, New York Marathon, you go into a race village and you get, bombarded with all these amazing donuts and coffee, and you're sitting around for a long time. Make sure that you pack your breakfast and your meal that you can, or your stomach can handle. Take that with you, and really try and avoid the temptation of all the goodies in the race village before you start your race. Try and keep things as normal and structured as you've done, and routine-based as you've done in your training leading up to the big day.
Also think about your long runs as something of a dress rehearsal for the event that you're going to be doing. And one of the things that we found with people is that they don't fuel the long runs. And what this does is it impacts the quality of the long run itself. Remember, your long run is to train you to be able to survive the distance of the race, the marathon, and to do it well. So if the long run is of a poor quality, you're not going to be getting the correct stimulus. So you want to fuel your long runs so that the performance of the long run is as good as it needs to be. And also think about your recovery afterwards. When you don't fuel for your long runs, you're going to struggle to recover properly after the run. You're going to be in a depleted state, which means you need to work harder to replenish your stores. And if your recovery after the long run is impaired, it actually affects the rest of the week following that. So think about the long run fueling as not just for training for your race, but also ensuring that you do your long run as best as you can and you recover appropriately afterwards for you to continue training throughout your cycle.
Now that you've got your fueling right to lead you up to race day, how do you make sure that you nail it on race day? The first consideration is how long and what intensity are you planning on racing at? So the fueling in a marathon, for example, is going to be quite different to the fueling for an ultra marathon, and the longer you go, the more that fueling needs to shift. So in a marathon that's typically lasting between 2.5 hours in extremely good athletes, all the way up to 6 to 6.5 hours for slower athletes, you can typically get away largely fueling on carbohydrates. But not all carbohydrates are created equally, and I don't mean that in terms of the value that they bring to the party. Sugar is sugar, but we don't all absorb and experience those sugars in the same way. Some are very texturally different. You get gels which are quite thick and syrupy, others that are more chewy, and others that are more jelly-like. You get lots of sweets and energy bars. So the important thing is that you need to experiment with these things before you get into race day. But on marathon day, you are typically looking for something that's easy to get in and that is high in sugar. These sugars don't always have to be synthetic. You can take them in the form of things like bananas or raisins or Chelsea buns or things that are more natural. But again, you need to experiment with this and work on what works for you, how often you need to take it in, and when to use them. As we move into longer distances like ultra marathons and multi-day events, you want to shift your focus to a mix of some of the easy energies, so that when you feel you've got a little bit of an energy low, you can just take something like a gel. But you want to shift further and further across to food, because the very highly concentrated sugar products are going to get tiresome. As blood is diverted away from your gastrointestinal tract, it's going to get harder and harder to absorb those, and they're going to sit in the intestine and irritate you. And so as we get into longer events, you do want to try and stick closer and closer to normal foods. Plus there is a definite increase in the requirement to take in proteins and to take in some fats. Okay, so it's really important that the longer the event, the more variety you have, and the best way to fuel is to really take in small amounts fairly regularly, because of that compromise in the gastrointestinal tract as that event goes on longer and longer and longer. So how do you calculate how much is enough? So for higher intensity exercise like in a marathon or slightly shorter than a marathon, the literature recommends 1 gram of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. The problem with that equation is that as soon as you move beyond the elite athlete of 50 to 60 kilograms and move into the 70, 80 and 90 kgs, that becomes really onerous. Trying to consume 80 grams of carbohydrates in an hour is an extreme amount of sugar, but because you've preloaded really well and you've done the things that you need to do leading up to race day, we do have some carbohydrate stores, and because of those carbohydrate stores, as muscle glycogen in the muscles, you can get away with 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates. My advice is that you do practice this as we've spoken about in the video, so that you can shift yourself to between 50 and 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And if you do that, then you are going to have adequate energy for completing a marathon. What does that mean? Practically, what does 50 to 60 grams an hour look like? Okay. In most gels, you've got between 23 and 26 grams of carbohydrates. In most energy drinks, you've got between 6 and 9 grams of sugar per 100 mils of fluid. So once you know that, you can then work out an equation of how many gels do I need per hour, and if I'm supplementing that with a bit of Gatorade or Powerade or some other energy drink on the side of the road, you can then work out how much of that product you need per hour. And therein lies why you want to practice that, because if that leaves you feeling a little bit blah, a little bit nauseous, your stomach doesn't feel good, or it gives you stitches when you are doing your lead-up runs and practice runs, then you know, okay, let me start looking outside at other products. Let me look at the back of the packaging on a granola bar, on an energy bar. A banana, for example, has roughly 20 grams of sugar per banana. So you'd have to eat an entire medium-sized banana to give you the same amount of sugar that you are getting from a gel. Again, that's why it makes it easier to take in a gel in one go, but if the gel makes you sick, it's no good. You're better off slowly taking a banana through the course of an hour, or raisins, which are highly concentrated in sugar because they're dehydrated grapes, but raisins essentially have about 85 grams of sugar per 100 gram mass. So raisins are actually a very easy way to get sugar in, however they're high in fiber. So if you are someone who's going to be sensitive to fiber and that's going to get your stomach working, it's not practical to use on race day. So again, the important thing here is look at the foods that are available to you, the things that you know work for you. I've had an athlete that's raced marathons on a Chelsea bun. A Chelsea bun also is very high in sugar, probably also in the region of it's not in the region, it's about 67 to 70 grams of sugar per 100 grams of bun. So it's very high in sugar, and so that if that is something that you can slowly eat through the race, you may need to get creative, but you want to add that up. When we move into the ultras, we still want to be fairly high in carbs. We want to shift that focus to a mix across a variety of carbohydrates, and we want to add in a little bit of protein. That might be in the form of a nut butter, or bread with peanut butter on it, or beef jerky, biltong as we call it in South Africa, in small amounts. But you want to work it out in a 4-to-1 ratio. So for every 4 grams of carbs that you're taking in, you want to take in 1 gram of protein, and there are endurance mixes on the market that are in that ratio, and because of that protein, it also dampens the sweetness and it makes it easier to consume over the long term. And if you take it one step further and add in a couple of fats into that as you go into multi-day events, you should be able to get that from eating foods that are pretty close to what you normally eat everyday life, but in much smaller amounts. And once again, there are always drinks that have got the right mix and balance of all these things that you can experiment with.
Post-race, there's a lot of things we could be doing from a nutrition perspective that is going to have a massive effect on your recovery. So first things first, you want to make sure that you get some form of carbohydrate and protein mix within 20 to 40 minutes after your race. That is really, really vital. Okay, that protein carb mix. So we're looking at a a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 carb, 1 protein. We've done a video before on how chocolate milk is an amazing source of carb and protein post training or post racing, and so that is really what we're looking for. Try and avoid things like alcohol. Yes, you've run your big race for the year. That's always nice to celebrate. The science has actually shown that 1 beer doesn't have too much of a detrimental effect. When we're going 2+ beers, that's going to have a diuretic effect and really dehydrate you more. So pay particular attention to your post-racing nutrition. Of course, if you can get a well-balanced meal in after your race, that would be ideal. I also know that from personal experience that eating straight afterwards isn't ideal. That's where that source of like a chocolate milk or something is really effective to use. This is going to have an effect in your following day's recovery, and to really make sure that if you are happening to get back into training soon enough, or you want to feel better straight after your race, this is something to pay attention to after your race.
Now that you know exactly how to fuel your race performance, and you've prepared yourself perfectly for race day, you don't want to blow the big day by pacing your race incorrectly. You can watch this video to make sure that your next race is a huge success.